To call this meeting of the City of West Hollywood Rent Stabilization Commission to order. Today is Thursday, September 26, 2019. If you please rise and join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Madam Secretary, can we have a roll call, please?
Of course. Commissioner O'Keefe. Commissioner Kerpes.
Here.
Commissioner Maggio.
Here.
Commissioner Martz.
Here.
Commissioner Charity.
Here.
Vice Chair Topchian.
Here.
Chair Bergstein.
Present. We have a quorum. Moving on to item 4, the approval of agenda. We all had a chance to review tonight's agenda. Do we have any suggestions for changes? If not, I'll entertain a motion to approve.
I'll make a motion to approve tonight's agenda.
I will second that.
So moved and approved. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Thank you. On to item 5, the minutes from September 12th. Have we all had a chance to review those minutes from our last meeting? Are there any corrections or changes?
Motion to approve.
I will second that.
Moved and approved. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Abstentions? Okay. I don't see any public comment slips. Do we have any public speakers this evening? I don't think so.
No.
Moving on to item 7, our manager's report. Mr. Noonan.
Good evening. A review of our look-ahead calendar. You'll notice I have gone ahead and populated study topics on meetings in October and November. We do have one appeal on the October 10th meeting, but the October 24th and November 14th meetings at this point are both open. And so you'll see on those 3 meetings, since it's been the Commission's policy when you do have one appeal, you will take on a study item if it's appropriate. So that night, we do have the Census 2020 Complete Count Committee update, which is a receive and file, and then information on the RSO deposit interest formula. This was a request from the Commission to look at that formula in a timely manner so that if there was any changes to be made that we perhaps could bring those forward to the Council with a recommendation before the end of the year. And then also, the Commission had requested that it review the study session date and consider moving the date to a January date or to perhaps having a second study session. So those are the items for your next meeting on October 10th. Then on October 24th, I have placed an update for you on proactive code enforcement. The City Council did receive an item from the offices of Lauren Meister and Lindsay Horvath and did direct staff to explore program and then directed that recommendation from staff to come here to the Rent Stabilization Commission. And so this next year you will receive recommendations from staff on creating a program and then forwarding your comments and that recommendation to the Council. We were also going to add that to your priorities list that you confirmed at the last meeting. So under the A section, that will be a new third A, and it will be the highest priority certainly because that was a direction that has some time sensitivity to it. On the November 14th date, we have an item which is one of your items off your priorities list, and it's an update on the customer service enhancements, our online tenancy registration, educational seminars, informational handouts, and website hearings and remedies. This is related to the question of making registration forms available at the hearings, and then mediation connection to resources. So I know there's been a number of questions about around our customer service and outreach and enhancements that we're doing. So that's an opportunity for us to bring that up and then also address the question out there about making those registration forms available at the hearings. So that concludes my comments. I do have the city clerk with me here this evening. There's been a question about how recommendations from the commission are forwarded to the city council. And so I'd like to offer her some time to just go through what the city council's policy on that is.
Just before you start, anybody have any questions for Mr. Newton at this point?
I do.
Okay. Thank you.
We anticipate any more hearings on these dates, even the cancel dates, or that's decided?
We still could have, we still could have a hearing either on the 24th or the 14th. Of course, there's only one study item on either of those meetings, and so certainly we could still place an appeal on that evening. I'm not sure that we would have double appeals, which is what the commission was experiencing this last year due to the large volume of appeals that came through the pipe all at once.
Thank you.
Are we combining this then with the unfinished business, or is it still a separate topic?
Combining which?
With the city clerk's
questions for Mr. Noonan?
presentation?
The city clerk is part of the manager's report.
Questions for Mr. Noonan? Okay. Yvonne?
Thank you, Peter. Thank you, commissioners, for having me here tonight. As Peter stated, I just wanted to give a little bit of background on the way that commissions and advisory boards can forward items to council, items that they would like to undertake. So sometime in 2017, the council created a subcommittee of the mayor and mayor pro tem to determine when commission and advisory board recommendations regarding certain topics should be presented to the full council for discussion. We were running into instances where commissioners and advisory board members felt that there were things that they wanted to discuss, and staff felt that some of the requests were outside of their purview, and this is all of our commissions and advisory boards. Or it was either outside of their purview or outside of their approved work plan, or maybe being worked on by another commission or advisory board, or staff felt that they needed to get direction from council. So the subcommittee was created so that this could be something that could be sent to the mayor and mayor pro tem, and they could determine on behalf of the council if the item warranted a staff report to the full council for discussion. Some requests were cut and dry. Some belonged to another body. Some were already being looked into by council. Some were approved. Some were denied. And some were provided by the mayor and mayor pro tem suggestions on how they could go about getting what they wanted accomplished, but maybe it couldn't be done in the way that they had asked. There were a couple of requests that, due to state law or statutes, the city would not be able to do certain requests, but the mayor and mayor pro tem provided direction. Either way, this was a mechanism by which commissioners and advisory boards could make these types of requests. So I looked back in my files because I am sort of the middle person. If a commissioner or advisory board has an item or program or project that they would like to look into that may or may not be in their purview or may have some implications that council would need to weigh in on, they would talk about it at their meeting. It would be an agendized item. A majority of the commission or board members would have to be in agreement that that would move forward to request given to the mayor and mayor pro tem. The action is then forwarded by staff to me, and I put it together in a memo, and that goes to the mayor and mayor pro tem, and then we get a response, and then that response is reported back to the body. So since 2017, we've had about 9 requests, and I think two or three of them have come from this body, so you're a little bit familiar with that mechanism. And I think that's all I had. That's sort of what happens, but if either of you have questions about it, I'm here to answer.
Just a quick one. What is the time frame if, let's say, if the commission sends, deliberates and requests something to be sent to the subcommittee? How fast, or what is the time frame that the city clerk would send it to the subcommittee?
Yeah, as soon as I receive the information and request from staff, either that day or the next day, I send it to the mayor and mayor pro tem. So there's no lag in that.
Thank you.
So in 2000, that was implemented in 2017? Were there ordinance changes during that time, or was that a policy?
It's just a policy, okay. And I believe it was, I don't remember if if he was mayor, I can't think back, but it was Councilmember D'Amico that talked about it a little bit, and they decided that it would be the mayor and mayor pro tem, whomever that may be each year, that would make that decision.
So when a recommendation from a commission is sent to the council subcommittee, and it's required in the ordinance, or in the ordinance, so like, let's say we made recommended a change to a regulation for the rent stabilization ordinance, that has to go to council, and if they don't act on it, it becomes law. It changes the regulation automatically. So how does that mesh with two council members deciding whether that would be valid or not? I'd like to hear from the city clerk if possible. 'Cause
Well, yeah, and I think that I might be better at answering this question for you, because this is about the rent regulations. And within the regulations in the code, it specifies clearly that this body, the Rent Stabilization Commission, does make those changes to the regulations, and it provides a mechanism by which those changes are enacted into the regulations itself. That is, that you take an action to amend the regulations, and then it's forwarded to the council. I believe it's if the council doesn't act within 45 days, they do become part of your regulations. So those regulations are separate and apart from the ordinance itself and ordinance changes.
how is it, I don't understand the separation, though.
The regulations are an actual freestanding document that are separate and apart from the ordinance. This is not part of this is not part of the RSO.
But if we make a recommendation to changing the regulation, or we make a recommendation to adding to the regulation, not changing the existing, but possibly adding to it, you're saying that would be treated differently? Because
There's a
adding to the
specific
regulation.
mechanism for the Rent Stabilization Commission to change the regulations. That is your duty. It's part of your duty is to change the regulations. That's the promulgate.
And that's my
That
question.
promulgate action in your duties is the regulations. And so you are the body that takes action to change the regulations. Your action is forwarded to the council. The council can affirm it. If they don't take action on it, I believe it's within 45 days, it becomes part of the regulations automatically.
And my question is, the things that are not obviously a change to the regulation, one could argue a certain action could be a change to the regulation, an addition, subtraction, change, and one would argue maybe that's not part of the regulation. Who decides that?
The regulations are changed by a resolution of this body. And so it sounds like the answer to your question would be this body would decide
That's what I would think.
for the
but-
regulations.
And that's where I'm confused. So then as a body, how do we, if we believe that we want to send something to the council as a recommendation, I'm not understanding the process that it goes through for the evaluation of whether it's a regulation or not.
So this, the Rent Stabilization Commission has made changes to the regulations in the past couple of years. But this commission has also made recommendations that would change the rent stabilization ordinance, the actual municipal code. And this body has no role in changing the ordinance, the municipal code. You do provide comment, but there's no mechanism within the code that requires that you make a recommendation to the council for that change to happen.
There's no trigger in the code that triggers the regulation change. When we move from this body to the next body, I'm not understanding what that trigger is other than it going to city clerk and then going to the subcommittee. And I'm not comfortable with.
Well, the regulations, and I could take a moment to find it maybe at the end of the meeting, but I believe it's either in the regulations or the ordinance. It might be the regulations where it actually specifies how the regulations are changed. And that's by that process that I outlined. But other items that the commission has recommended on haven't been relative to the regulations. They have not been specific to the regulations. They've been other larger items. And so those have been forwarded to the council.
And I think you may be right on most of those, but let's say you were wrong. I mean, it would be me and you arguing back and forth about that. That's what I'm trying to highlight is that this may work for advisory boards, but this doesn't work for commissions that have a set role within the statute. Just as the, my other question actually has to do with when we recommend on housing policy, I believe it's number 4 of our duties. How do we make recommendations to the city council under your?
Like I said, and I can only speak for the things that have come before us before, some things are pretty cut and dry. I think if there's some items that you all want to discuss that are related to housing policy and that fall within your purview and you've discussed it with staff, there may not be a question about it. It would be put on your agenda, you would talk about it and make that recommendation under a staff report to council. Those are the easy ones. And the reason why there's only been 9 since 2017, because there are always these outliers. There are items that aren't as clear for staff or may not be as clear for the Rent Stabilization Commission or any other commission. Maybe it's something that they had never done before, never thought about, and something has happened or someone thought about it and said, hey, let's look into this, let's see if we can do something about this. And so that would be where you would have an item on your agenda. You would need a majority of the commission to agree that that item should move forward to the subcommittee. Staff would prepare a memo, I would give it to the subcommittee, we'd get the response, and it would be brought back to you. But on regulations, if I'm remembering correctly, that is something that's under the purview of the commission, and you can amend and change regulations as you see fit. That wouldn't be something that would go to the subcommittee. If there was a question about it and you wanted to get direction from council, then that would just be a staff report to council, if you wanted some direction on what you wanted.
So if we have general recommendations that are not specific to the regulations, because it sounds like there's a very clear, we're being told tonight that there is definitely a clear mechanism in the changing or making recommendations to change the regulations, but if we're making changes to or recommending changes to housing policy or recommending this to the city council on housing policy, you're saying that that should be turned into a staff report that goes to the subcommittee.
If that is something that is outside of what you would normally do and you and staff are sort of wanting to get some sort of direction from council. If it's something that I think there was, I'm thinking of what was sent to them before, and it was the non-smoking policy in apartments. That somehow started here. It was a conversation and you wanted that, you wanted to talk about it and discuss it and have that something that you would research and have some approval authority over. That was sent to the subcommittee. They approved that, and that item was brought to council for full discussion, and it moved forward. So,
but on a different one, one that, because I can't speak for all 9 of the the things that have come to the council, but I can, based on my experience here on the commission, we've only recently started sending things to the council after years of debate whether we could or couldn't, just internally on the commission. We've done more of that in the last year than I can say probably happened in the last 15, 18 years. But we have struggled in those 4 or 5 times. And I think each time we've sent something to the council, it gets a little bit more clear and we give a little bit more direction about what we're asking from council. So a better example, I think, would be a more recent one where we specifically, as a commission, requested the council make a decision whether we could weigh in on an issue in front of that was then in front of the Planning Commission. That's not what we got. The subcommittee, from what I understand, didn't agree, and that's different than the council hearing it and sending it back or not taking action on it.
correct. What was that item?
It was the 1-year zone text amendment changed for 1 year for tenancies. Still an ongoing issue.
Okay, and so that was sent to the mayor and Mayor Pro Tem, and they didn't agree that you all needed to weigh in before it went to the Planning Commission? Was that the one?
I mean, Peter can correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe it went through your office as well.
So it's my understanding that the council had already taken an action, and that what this was a clarification of a director's policy or determination related, maybe. This was a clarification of a director's ruling on the zoning code. And it was to the Planning Commission, and then it was to the City Council. By the time this body made a request to the council, it was already with the council on an agenda going forward. The noticing had to be redone, and so it was pulled back. So when this commission's recommendation was confirmed by the commission, because the recommendation was not, it was convoluted enough that we brought it back in the minutes and confirmed that what the direction was at the next meeting. The day after, I forwarded that to Yvonne, but at that point, it was within the council was already looking at the item, and so there was a discussion at the executive level. But there was ultimately there was a decision made to take it to the subcommittee. We did take it to the subcommittee. The subcommittee did reject the request for that item to come to this commission.
My question is actually for the clerk, but it's become clear that since we're not all on the same page as to what the facts were, there's no reason for me to continue down this line. But those are one of the examples that I would hope that maybe you could look at the last couple of meetings. I mean, because there was several meetings that we discussed this, and we made, as the commission, made it quite clear towards the end what it was that we wanted. That's my recollection. It's different than the managers. But I hope you will take a look at that to maybe be able to come back at a later date to, or maybe just give me a call and explain what it is that I'm missing, and how that didn't fall into, which category that would have fallen into, and why your office isn't more aware of it, since we had been told that.
I'm aware of it. It's just there are so many items.
I'm
and
sure.
I deal with a lot of items with council, a lot of items with other commission and advisory board members. And I do remember that there was a timing issue. The finite details of it, I don't remember, but I remember that there was an item that was requested. But because that item was already, it was requested from you all, that item was already on the agenda for council to look at and make a decision. There wasn't time to have the mayor, yes, you guys can talk about it. It was already on that agenda. What led up to that, I know there were some issues and suggestions and concerns, but I will say for the most part, this way of doing things has been positive. I think a lot of commissions and advisory boards had some things that they wanted to do, and the mayor and mayor pro tem allowed it, and it was then brought back to be shaped a little more. Sometimes they give some direction in that, and yes, bring it back, but look at it this way, or add this, or, you know. So I think it's gotten better over time. It has only been 2 years or so that we've been doing it. And like I said, we haven't gotten that many, because most of the time people are wanting to do things that are already on their work plan, or something that they've done in the past and they want to revisit. One of the more recent ones was from you all, was the routine inspections. And I think this was done a while ago, and it's something that was brought back. But when it was done before, it was done under a certain, I think it was CDBG funds. Those funds went away, and so those routine inspections went away. And now you all thought about maybe this should be something that should come back. It went to the subcommittee, and it's sort of moving forward. So there have been some hiccups, but I think it's getting smoother as time goes on.
Would it help?
I have one quick question. So my question is about the response time, or memorializing a response from that subcommittee. In particular with the routine inspection, that is something that came through this commission. We had either an ad hoc committee or a subcommittee did a report and asked that subcommittee to look at that item, and we never heard back if they had done so. So it was a little bit of a surprise when Mr. Noonan said at our last meeting it was going to be on council's agenda this last week. And I don't know for a fact if what was brought up at last Monday's meeting was a result of what we discussed here, or separate and apart. So shorter question is when a board or commission brings something to you that board or commission would like brought to that subcommittee, could there be a mechanism where you could kind of keep track of that and go, rent stabilization brought up these 3 items and a memorandum to our manager to present to us at our meeting going, subcommittee has heard this item, approved or rejected, or subcommittee has not heard this item, just so that we kind of know where we stand on items that we send to that subcommittee?
What should be happening, and I do have my own way of monitoring, but when we receive the response from the mayor and mayor pro tem, it goes back to the staff liaison, manager, director, whomever brought it forward, and it should then be reported back to the commission by that person. So in this case, it would go back to Peter. Peter would come back to the appropriate meeting and talk to you all about what that response was. That's the way it should work.
So then maybe I'll tag on to Peter. Would there be a way that you could keep a running memorandum for your file of items that we have sent to the subcommittee, and then just as part of your report saying they have taken action on this item or they have not yet, just so we know where we stand?
Yeah, I think that's fine. What I've done in the past is let you know when it has gone forward, and then when I hear back. But would you want something on your, just as part of the manager's report while it's pending?
I would appreciate that, just because it seems like, we didn't know what was going on with the SCEP. We've had other items that we just don't really know what the status is, and I'm always hesitant to keep contacting the mayor and mayor pro tem going, that Bergstein, he's turning into a nudge, let's just skip his item. So I'd feel more comfortable if staff were to say they've taken no action on this yet, or what the action was. I would appreciate that as part of your manager's report.
Sure.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's not a problem.
Commissioner Kerpes?
Yeah, actually, it turned to 2 questions now.
Okay.
Sorry. So when the commission takes action on an item, when is that action official? Is it when we take the vote, or is it when at some future date when minutes are approved?
I'm not quite sure I understand the
So
question.
a lot of times we will have appeals, for example. We have an appeal, we'll make a decision, but we actually see well, I guess we do see the resolution. Sometimes we will make a change to the resolution that's in front of us, and then they'll bring it back. Staff will bring it back at a future meeting. If it's a minor change, it's not necessarily brought, I believe it is typed up and the chair signs it, but there's no official action again after we have voiced in an open meeting, taken a vote, it's recorded. I'm trying to get...
So for an appeal, there is a resolution, and when the resolution is adopted by the body, it is valid.
That's valid.
Right.
So so if we set that appeal aside, that we make a motion for some other issue, are our acts real time? I don't understand. There was a comment earlier about we didn't memorialize it until a few meetings later when we passed the minutes. I understand that if there's questions on what the motion was, we clarify that and we vote, and that's the official act. I didn't know that minutes served as, because we passed the minutes at least 2 weeks after any action, but that doesn't, I didn't know that meant the action was at a later date, that it was only true once it was memorialized in minutes.
No, if you all are making a decision on something, you've had a vote, that action is valid from that moment. I don't know if Peter meant he went back to the minutes to memorialize what you wanted, because in the instance that you were referring to, there was some...
No, I understand there can be
Right.
confusions.
So
sometimes.
maybe, right, so, I don't want to speak for you, I don't know if that's what you meant, you went back to the minutes to try to understand exactly what
And I just
had
want to know.
transpired.
I just want to know in general.
In
with
general,
minor,
if-
with few
if you all
outliers,
make
when we act, it's that's the action.
If you vote to make a I'm just using this, vote to make a recommendation to council for X, Y, and Z, it's acted as it's approved at that very moment, and it should move forward as such.
Okay, and my last question is regarding in the meetings since 2017, or actually I don't know if it was related or not. I'm sorry, I don't want to imply that. I know the council had asked at some point over the years, I believe it was Councilmember Meister and Councilmember D'Amico, and they must have had one more, but they felt that they weren't getting, across the board, it was after the deputies left, and they weren't feeling as though they fully were getting all the information from the commission and advisory boards and what was happening. So they asked for commission advisory boards to present, I don't know if it's monthly or every other month, but they usually in the
Synopsis.
yeah, the synopsis in the minutes or the agenda items, usually under consent. Would it be helpful if this commission did that? We had used that as our mechanism in the past to get things to the council. In fact, the smoking thing was one of the things that was listed in one of those early on. Is that helpful or not helpful?
That is helpful, and we, I believe, received an action report synopsis from the Rent Stabilization Commission for our last meeting, and it should be that way going forward.
Thank you.
So it'll be just a synopsis of every meeting that you had, the actions that you took, if there was some comment that needed to be put into there for the council to know, it'll be in their monthly packets. You guys meet twice, so it could probably be in both packets for council each month.
Thank you.
Thank you for being here and answering our questions and shedding more light on the process. I've got two areas where I'm a little confused, and I was hoping that you could help me work through it. One is I'm a little confused on what it is that we as a body can agendize ourselves. I think in our bylaws it says we can put something on our own agenda, not the council's agenda, versus what we need, kind of the prior approval of council to consider ourselves. And so I was hoping you could help with that.
So yeah, it's the same as any other commissioner advisory board. If you want to place something on the agenda, it should be something that's under your purview. So it wouldn't be appropriate for you to place something on your agenda to talk about senior month, or a land use issue. So it would be something that's under your purview. If you wanted to, you could say, I am requesting that we place A, B, or C on the next agenda. You would need to get a majority vote from your fellow commissioners that, yes, they agree that that should be placed on a future agenda, and then it would be placed on a future agenda. I will say with the caveat, sometimes even myself, when we are here for council meetings and council will say, hey, we want to place this on the next agenda, and you'll sometimes hear our city manager say, well, it probably won't be on the next agenda because that's pretty much set. It may be on the next agenda, so be open for that.
Understood. I know it takes staff some time to explore large new
Oh,
issues
and
when they have a lot on their plate.
If I could just add a little caveat onto that the commissions and the boards don't direct the work of staff, the council does. And so if it is an item that's going to create a lot of staff work, better for the commission to put it on your agenda and ask direction from the council in order to study it so that we staff then have the direction from council to go forward and do that body of work.
So how does that play in with our items that we've approved as part of our priorities for this coming year? To take up each and every one of those, would we need to go ask staff, since they presumably will take some time? The council, or is it just kind of they're listed as our priorities if they have a concern?
Yeah, and
they'll
we're
let us
actually
know?
putting that on the council's agenda, so they will receive that as part of your priorities. And it's, in my recollection, I don't think that there's anything on there that rises to the level of what I'm talking about. Maybe a good example of this would be when the commission wanted to study proactive code enforcement. And so the commission, you created a subcommittee, and you met and came back and reported on when you met. But that whole process really didn't take a lot of staff time and effort. And so that, and then the recommendation was created, that was forwarded to the council. Now the council has directed staff to develop a recommendation and bring it back. And so I think that's a really good example of a good path forward when an item ultimately would take a lot of staff time. It's that direction, study it, take that direction forward to the council, and then let the council direct us, staff, to then go forward with that and bring it back for review.
And then my one other area of some confusion is what exactly is our purview? And we're, of course, have had this on our agenda for a couple times. As was mentioned, the last piece of the ordinance that created this commission or directed its work says we shall evaluate and make recommendations to the city council relative to the city's housing policies. And I know we're kind of talking this through internally, but I've just felt some confusion and like there hasn't necessarily been 100% consistency on what seems to be considered in our purview and what isn't. So for example, the non-smoking policy and the routine inspections, since they were approved, I assume that they were, but then that zone text amendment where we had hoped to be able to get a presentation ourselves and kind of weigh in. I understand there was a timing issue, but the timing issue seems separate than we were told it actually wasn't in our purview, and I know it was in planning's purview, but in other commissions, there are a number of things that go to 2 to 3 to 4 commissions, and to me, it seemed like housing policy would likely encompass that, just for the purview question.
Yeah, I'll answer as best as I can. I think that the municipal code for some commissions is broad, and I know that we've had conversations with this, and council has said themselves that it was done that way on purpose because you don't want to sort of pigeonhole a commission or advisory board into just doing certain things forever. So you don't want to have to keep updating the municipal code either. But I think you have a valid question, and I've talked to Peter about this, and I know you all have talked to Peter about trying to fine-tune exactly what council meant when they said housing policies. And so I think that may be a question for council. So that would be something that you guys could take up. If I could suggest, maybe think of some things that you would like to do as it relates to housing policy. Sorry if I'm stepping on your toes, Peter, but this is just thinking the best way forward. And you know, it's always good to come to council with something. So have 3 or 4 bullet points of some things that you'd like to do that you think would fall under a housing policy, and have them confirm that for you. And have a discussion about it in a council meeting. Let them decide what they mean when they say that you can weigh in on housing policies. I think that would be the best way to go.
Thank you.
Just wanted to dovetail on, I think Mr. Noonan's gotten very good at, there have been times when you've had really packed agendas with your staff. I know there was a point where you were doing the aging in place and something, there were 2 really large items that your staff was working on. So it wasn't that there wasn't staff available to do items that we wanted to discuss, it was just that your plate was really full. And at least from my perspective, you've gotten really good at going, we can't handle this item right now, but let's agendize that for later on when our plate is less full, because there are times when your staff is busy 24/7, and I appreciate that perspective. Any further questions for Yvonne at this point? Thank you for coming out tonight.
All right, thank you. You guys have a good rest of
Thank you.
Thank you.
Move on to item 7, commission comments.
I have one. Myself and Commissioner Kerpes attended the Census 2020 meeting last week. West Hollywood is really pushing, and all cities are pushing forward to make sure that every person is counted in the census. So it was a planning strategy session. It was actually quite fun. And our city clerk was there as well. She was at my table. And my passion is homelessness, so I was very interested in how we count homeless people. And instead of a survey or someone coming to your door, homeless people are counted in a 3-day survey just by a visual count, kind of like we do with the homeless count. So that's something that I assume Commissioner Kerpes will continue with, and I will continue with as well, to put in place strategies for the city to make sure that every person is counted in our city.
Any further commission comments? Commissioner Kerpes?
I have an announcement for my day job. Assemblymember Richard Bloom is hosting a senior scam stopper event with the Contractor State Licensing Board in Beverly Hills on Thursday, October 3rd from 10:30 to 12. And if you call our office, we can give you more details. That's Thursday, October 3rd, and our number is 310-450-0041.
Where's it being at?
It will be held at Sunrise of Beverly Hills on Crescent Drive.
Any further commission comments? Okay. 2 quick ones. One, I wanted to say that I did review the council packet this last week and was pleased to see that there was a report from this commission included in the boards and commissions, so I do appreciate that. And second, I wanted to give a compliment to one of your staff members, Danielle. I had a vacancy in late May. I re-rented that unit in mid-June, re-registered online on the new portal. That tenant subsequently broke the lease and moved out after 2 months, and I re-registered that unit about a week and a half ago, and Danielle followed up to make sure, because it's a little unusual to see re-registration of the same unit twice in 2 months. We just want to make sure that you're being accurate. Is that the correct unit? So I appreciate the thoroughness of your staff following up on that. Thank you. Moving on to item 9, we have no appeals this evening. Moving on to item 10, new business. We'll discuss the code amendments related to alternative maintenance standards for designated cultural resources subject to the RSO.
So thank you. I'd like to introduce Doug Vu. Doug Vu is in our planning office. He's in the current and historic preservation planning, and he's been primarily working on this and has a small a little presentation for you, or speech.
Thank you, Peter. Good evening, Chair Bernstein and members of the commission. I'm Doug Vu with the department's planning staff. So the item before you is a review of a proposed amendment to the rent stabilization ordinance establishing an alternative from the current painting schedule requirements for rent stabilized cultural resources. So as a result of a multi-year process to study and investigate new incentives that would promote the preservation of rent stabilized historic multifamily buildings in West Hollywood, last October, the City Council directed staff to implement 4 primary economic incentives that would encourage, the maintenance and rehabilitation of these properties. One of these incentives includes modifying a maintenance requirement that's currently under the rent stabilization ordinance. So currently, the ordinance requires that interior common areas are painted no less than once every 4 years, and that building exteriors are painted no less than once every 7 years. However, this requirement can be destructive to the underlying historic materials due to the many layers of paint that accumulate over time, which has been proven to be harmful and often difficult to maintain or repair. So the proposed amendment will not require this painting schedule for historical buildings, but instead provide flexibility by allowing the structure to be painted when it's deemed necessary, and stipulating that they be maintained in compliance with provisions under the Historic Preservation Ordinance pertaining to the maintenance and repairs. So this amendment also states that a rent adjustment may be granted if a landlord fails to comply with a Mills Act contract requirement or an order made by the Planning and Development Services Director to paint a designated resource. So what this means is that for owners, it eliminates a conflict that currently exists between the rent stabilization ordinance and historic preservation best practices. It provides flexibility from the ordinance maintenance standards, and it also, directs maintenance efforts away from unnecessary painting that could damage buildings and could potentially direct that towards other maintenance efforts that could be made to the building instead. And for the tenant, it ensures that the property will be properly maintained, and there's a provision in there for penalties if they do not perform the maintenance. So that's about it, and I'm here to answer any questions you might have. Thank you.
So it says that in the proposed text of the revised amendment that notwithstanding the exemption, a rent adjustment may be granted when the landlord has failed to comply with an order made by the Planning and Development Services Director to paint. My question is how that happens. Of course, in the context of the rent stabilized housing, the tenant themselves can make a complaint and they might have a modest filing fee, but the city helps them and there's an appeal process. Can the tenant themselves complain to the Planning and Development Services Director, or how would this happen?
Yes, so for properties that are under a Mills Act contract, so each Mills Act contract has a maintenance plan that gets adopted when the contract goes into effect. And oftentimes, that maintenance plan will identify specific work that needs to be done. And typically, something like, painting of the building or whatever may be included in there. So that, that would apply for properties under Mills Act. For properties that are not, like you indicated, if a tenant lodged a complaint, with the city would be required to investigate that. And since the building is a designated cultural resource, it is required to comply with the maintenance standards that are under our historic preservation ordinance. And so the city would basically, require the landlord or property manager to, to bring that property into conformance with those standards. And that could include, painting the building.
Let me add on to that a little bit.
Excuse me 1 second, Richard.
Yes, exactly. It's the triggering mechanism. So when a tenant came in to file a rent reduction application, that would trigger with internally communication between rent stabilization staff and planning staff, so that we would then go ahead and look at that and investigate the item as part of that process and application.
My one concern is I want it to be very clear and easy for a tenant to complain to someone, and it looks like as it's written, there has to be a pre-existing order from the planning services and the Mills Act, and I wasn't entirely clear as if it's as user-friendly and easy for a tenant to go to the planning commission, whereas they're used to going to the rent stabilization and housing department, if it would be possible and feasible for them to complain to the rent stabilization department if it hadn't been, in their view, maintained in good order, and then that department could consult with planning. I'm wondering if that would
That's
be
exactly how it's going to be implemented. Of course, this is going to be adopted into the rent stabilization ordinance, and so that first point of contact will still be with rent stabilization, and we'll maintain good contact with the planning office on this. Just for context, for those commissioners that have been here for a little more than 6 years. One of the genesis of this need and the subcommittee was a building where there was some appliques on the walls, and not painting over the appliques was in direct conflict with our painting requirement, yet maintaining the appliques was part of the Mills Act requirement. And so we realized that there was internal conflict between our RSO and the Mills Act requirements for preserving the historic structure. And so that's why that's the part of the genesis of this language. And we certainly do want to make sure that it's going to still function well for for tenants. We don't want a situation where a tenant and a proper rent reduction can be lost in the process simply because of a bureaucratic issue between two different offices. And so we do, planning and rent stabilization and housing, maintain very close contact on a number of other items. And so this one, we would maintain that same close connection.
Thank you. Maybe this should be later in the discussion, but I'd suggest just a little wording tweak to make sure there's no confusion and that a person knows if they think it hasn't been maintained in good repair, they can still file, so that would be clear in the language of the ordinance.
Commissioner Martz?
My question is, so the 4-year and 7-year rules that we have are very clear to tenants, and when I used to do landlord-tenant law, it would be very easy to be like, find out when they painted, find out when they replaced your carpets, interior, exterior, whatnot. This standard is obviously a bit more complex, like my fellow commissioner was saying, and so user friendliness is a big concern here. How are tenants going to know the difference here? Are we going to do an education campaign that these things are changing? How is that going to be advised? Because there's a lot of barriers for tenants, especially people who are ESL or low income, to even come into a government building. And then if we are making it more difficult for them to understand how this process works and what the requirements are of a landlord, I feel like it's going to scare off a lot of the people who may find it easy to say, okay, they haven't painted in 4 years, I can file, as opposed to even trying to understand what the Mills Act is.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, and we can definitely notify the tenants. Planning staff will work with, housing division staff to make sure that, tenants are notified and are aware that, that these new provisions are in place with respect to historic buildings that are rent stabilized.
And do you know how many buildings we're talking about in the city of West Hollywood that this is actually going to affect? Is this a relatively minor amount of properties?
So the number of buildings that would be in effect under this would be, there are 39 multifamily properties in the city containing about 600 dwelling units. So
Really?
yeah.
So It's possible that we could direct mail or something to let these people know directly that their requirements and their standards are going to be changing once it happens. It's not, it doesn't sound like it's too cost prohibitive for the city.
We're looking into that. No, it's not at all. And not only are we looking into doing that notification to existing tenants, but we're also looking at if there's a means for us to identify these units within our registry and send a notice because we send out new tenant packets. And so this would be a notice to these tenants that there's a different standard in place for paint.
Okay, great. I appreciate the answers, and I do applaud this. I think that, protecting our historic buildings is important, and if there's conflict, I'm glad to see that we're moving towards that. So I appreciate the effort in the presentation. Thank you.
Commissioner Maggio?
For staff, could you do a quick review as to how a building does qualify for the Mills Act? And is it the same in every municipality? Is it the same in West Hollywood as it would be in Los Angeles?
So certain cities, certain certified local governments, can adopt a Mills Act program. Not all cities do that. West Hollywood is one of the cities, obviously, that does. The general sort of guidelines and parameters for setting up the program are very similar. But in terms of how each city administers its program specifically, I think that what the state does, it allows each respective city a lot of sort of latitude in terms of how it administers its individual program. But in terms of what properties would be eligible, obviously it has to be a designated historic resource, and obviously when the city enters into a Mills Act contract, it is done in coordination with the assessor's office, the county assessor's office, which they're the ones who actually calculate what the assessed value of the property is, and which helps to determine what the tax benefit or tax savings would be for a particular property owner. So West Hollywood, we work within those guidelines that have been established. But in terms of administering the program, there's a sufficient amount of ability for us to sort of tailor our program so that it fits the needs of the city.
So if a building, is it the same if a building is considered historic, it can then qualify for the Mills Act, or can it be historic and not be, the Mills Act not be applied, Mills Act not be applied?
So a building has to be a designated historic resource in order to apply for a Mills Act contract, but it is not required to.
Okay. Because I know in Los Angeles, for instance, they seem to be stricter, like if you change a window, you don't qualify. I think here we give a little bit more leeway. Is that so, or?
Well, when a building is designated as historic, I mean, before a building is designated as historic, the city will make sure that it possesses enough, historic integrity to be able to convey its historic significance. So, if let's say, for instance, if a particular building wants to become designated in West Hollywood, we will go through the process of doing a historical resource assessment. And as part of that process, we will determine whether or not, the building is eligible to be considered historic. And so if alterations have been made that significantly change, the historic character of the building so that it's no longer able to convey its significance, then the city would not recommend that, that it become designated.
What if there is like a facade and that could be removed? Would that bring it back into compliance?
So if I understand you correctly, I mean, if a facade was removed and the intent was to restore the facade?
It's perhaps whatever, it's behind the facade, the real building.
It could be done if the work is consistent with the Secretary of Interior standards for the rehabilitation of historic properties. So there are specific, techniques and procedures that must be followed. If a building would like to do that, and if that can be done consistent with those standards, then yes.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Kerpies?
I want to go back to understanding how this process works again. So are we taking this completely out of, if a tenant were to make a complaint about the maintenance issue on the paint, this commission would have no role in that from this point on, if this were passed, correct? It would be dependent upon the Planning and Development Services Director?
So because the Mills Act maintenance requirements would apply in this situation, it would follow those regulations which are in the zoning code. And so that would be the Planning and Development Services Director and the Planning Commission and the City Council, that's the body that establishes the Mills Act, identifies the character-defining features of the building, and establishes the maintenance requirements for maintaining that Mills Act and maintaining in compliance with the Mills Act. If for any reason there was it was maintenance that fell outside of that, or that maintenance was not in compliance, and the property owner was not in compliance, and the tenants were due a rent reduction, that hearing application would come forward through the hearings examiner, and that appeal would come forward to the Rent Stabilization Commission. So the maintenance of the Mills Act contract in and of itself, it would not be within the purview of this body, but any violation of that would trigger a rent reduction would then be within this body's purview.
So under that scenario, so let's say the Planning and Development Services Director found that it was not in compliance. They were in violation of the Mills Act. Would that tenant's complaint then automatically go to a hearing examiner to determine what, if any, reduction in services or reduction in that issue dealing with maintenance?
We would, well, of course, the property owner would have 30 days to come into compliance before the tenant could then file for the requested rent reduction, but it would still be dependent on the tenant filing for the reduction. The tenant would be notified of the situation of the issue, and so they would be able to file for that reduction after the 30 days had lapsed.
So then I guess that brings up another question. Let's say there's a scenario where the tenant makes the complaint to the city of the Mills Act violation versus the city somehow finds and determines that they are out of the Mills Act. So I understand the 30 days. If the city were to find that they were out of compliance, 30 days would start for that tenant, or it's 30 days the landlord would have an opportunity to fix whatever the problem was. But in the case of the tenant brought it to the city would then start this entire long process of the determination before the tenant's 30 days would start. I know this is like very, we're just trying to play.
So the tenant, so in this scenario, the tenant has come to the rent stabilization office and said, there's an issue here. And we have then taken it up and worked with planning. Planning has reviewed it, and they've agreed that there's an issue and have notified the landlord, and we've followed up with the tenant. And so the tenant, the landlord has 30 days essentially, and then the tenant is able to file for the rent reduction. If there's a question here about whether the city should be filing the rent reduction on behalf of the tenant, I can answer that. And I think it's important that we do not do that, because then we are a party to the case and we need to remain separate and apart. We're non-partial. So it does need to be in the responsibility of the tenant to file. But I think that, I'm not sure that we have a lapse in timeline, but maybe let me give it a little bit of thought, because of course there is going to be a little bit of a lapse for the planning office to determine that the Mills Act has in fact been violated. And then of course, and then the 30 days would start, of course. And so I'm not sure what that timing would be, or what the, how much time the director would need to make that determination. But that ultimately would be something that's not typically in our code now.
Yeah, if we could definitely look at that a little closer. I mean, just if you guys as staff could think about that and just try to, we oftentimes see tenants strung out over several months of different issues that come up, and then the third or fourth week, the landlord fixes it, and then this cycle goes on and on and on and on. I wouldn't want this to be make it more difficult for tenants. My other concern, and I should probably preface this all by saying that I believe that we should preserve and offer incentives to landlords for historic buildings, and I've generally supported this all the way through. I kind of fell into this several years ago, when they were looking at incentives for the historic buildings. One of the biggest one of the things I always hear about the Mills Act from people, not just in this city, but in all cities, is that the landlord gets a benefit and no one enforces it. So you're asking us tonight to basically put the trust of the protection of the tenants, in this case anyway, to put that back in the hands of the city. And I don't know what the city's record is on Mills Act enforcement, and but I've heard the complaints in this city just as I have in others. How can you give us some level of confidence that the city's actually going to enforce this?
Yes, actually, when I mentioned earlier that, cities have a certain amount of latitude in enforcing it, one of those things is particularly that issue, the issue of inspections. I mean, the guidelines say that, the city should be inspecting properties once every 5 years. And so, but that's just a guideline. And so whether or not each individual city decides to do that is really upon them. And so as part of this study, this multi-year study, one of the things that the city council wanted the city to do was basically improve our Mills Act sort of, inspection process. And so one of the directives that we received was a more robust, program in terms of inspections and making sure that properties are in compliance with their contracts. And so that's something that, that the planning department is working on as well. And that was one of the actual, one of the 4 directives that city council had directed staff to implement.
Thank you. And then the other issue, how do we, I know that we are doing this for the historic purposes and to preserve and not cause damage to having another layer of paint, that could cause even more damage than necessary. But how do we justify to tenants throughout the city? The landlord is receiving an incentive for doing this. The landlord or the tenant, even though they are benefiting from a historic building, are usually paying for that benefit. And we have a tenant in, say, just an average building. It's also under the rent stabilization ordinance. You have both tenants, same situations. They're paying for what they're getting when they moved in. But we're saying that, well, in 4 years, and I'm saying 4 years, I'm just going to assume that they've all entered into an apartment that has brand new paint. We're telling one tenant that in 4 years, your rent's going to continue going up, or your paint under the same conditions would be the same condition in 4 years than the other person is if they have the same conditions. But this person over here has an opportunity to get a maximum of $33 a month reduction. I understand the benefits of why we would want to do this for landlords. I'm not sure if I see the benefit to the tenants, though. I almost see it as a loss to the tenant in that unit. I don't know if there's an answer to that. I don't know if that's really a question, but that's one of my thoughts about that. And overall, like I said, that's about all I have. Overall, I support what we're trying to do here. I don't know if this in front of us is the best way to do it, though.
Mr. Charity?
My questions were already asked and answered.
Mr. Vice Chair?
Just a couple of comments. I'm a little bit concerned about it. I understand the reasoning, and I agree that this modification would somehow benefit the buildings that are designated a historic resource. But I agree with Commissioner Kerpis' some of the comments. So what is the benefit to the tenant who occupies the unit? Because right now, when I'm reading it, the modifications, it's very generic. It says more routine inspections. As you mentioned, 5 years currently. But how often these inspections will be conducted? And who, is this the city's code enforcement inspections? The code enforcement officers, right, that will conduct these inspections. And you mentioned something about 5 years, every 5 years. Is it under current code? You mentioned something about 5 years. Can you clarify?
So the 5 years that's what the state's guidelines are.
Oh, state
but that's
guidelines.
that's not codified.
Okay.
And in terms of doing the inspections, it's the planning department staff that actually conducts those inspections as part of the Mills Act program.
Who conducts inspections?
It's the planning department staff.
Planning department.
Yeah, not code enforcement.
Okay. So I have my concerns about it because when we talk about the rent stabilization standards, the standards are really high, and we know that under the rent stabilization ordinance there are certain provisions that make it very strict. They make strict rules for the property owners to follow, and such as, for example, once every 4 year painting requirement or 7-year exterior painting requirement. So now, by making these modifications and removing that 4-year requirement, I'm really concerned that may affect negatively the quality of the tenant unit, because at this point we will have to fully rely on the planning department's inspections. While when we current system allows the tenant to come forward and to request that painting. So now if this is going to be based on the whether the paint is needed or not, if that is a decision up to the planning department staff, I have concerns whether that's going to be really. Whether the tenants' rights or the process will be maintained in the same way that we have now. And then it seems to me also this modification would add some extra layers for the tenants to come forward with a complaint process. Right now, they can go and they can file the application, and it will take 30 days to get the hearing. And now they have to prove something that the planning department inspector would not agree with it. So now that's going to be the burden on the tenant to explain or prove why the paint is needed. Let's say after 4 years, the tenant comes forward and says, "I want to repaint my unit." So under the ordinance, it is a requirement. Now if the inspections will say, no, your paint is okay, you don't need the painting right now, so we're saying that the tenant come back in another 4 years, just wait for another 3-4 years and come back with that. I don't know, it seems to me it's like we're talking about preservation of the historic structure, but not about the preservation of the rent stabilization. And just one. I know that you want to explain, but maybe we can. Maybe this modification could apply only to the exterior, not the interior of the unit, because when the tenant rents the unit is already painted. So if we're saying that damage is done to the historic structure, it's already been done. So now it's about putting another white color. So I don't think that's going to create a damage. I'm not a specialist, but I'm thinking maybe we can. I understand the preservation of the exterior of the building, but the interior, I don't believe it's going to really, harm the historic building. So
It could.
that's the
though.
question.
It could. There's only 1 year difference.
So
difference.
let me take a moment to walk the commission through this, and let's just pretend that we're a tenant in a historic building and we want our unit repainted. Now, importantly, within the Mills Act and within the historic code, the reason that makes a building historic is it's called character-defining features of the building, and these are the
Called what, I'm sorry?
architectural or otherwise
It's called what, I'm sorry, character?
character-defining features. That's within the Secretary of the Interior, it's within the Interior State's definition for historic preservation. In order for a building or a resource to be registered as historic, you have to have certain character-defining features. Those are recorded and part of the cultural resources at the property, and a Mills Act is designed to maintain those character-defining features. Now, here in the city of West Hollywood, it sounds like that's only within the common areas and the exterior of the building. Perhaps there is a rare case where you could have some form of a character-defining feature within the unit, but it sounds like in the cases that we have, the buildings that are out there, that's not the case. And so paint within the interior of the units of the apartments is going to follow that 4-year paint schedule that's already there in place. The Mills Act doesn't apply. The Mills Act contract is not specific to those units. The Mills Act is specifically addressing the character-defining features that make that building historic. So for instance, on a property where you have, let's say hypothetically, 3 structures, one of those structures has been determined to be historic, whereas the other 2 are not. Okay, you can modify all 3 structures. You do have to receive a certificate of appropriateness from the planning office before you can do that because the property is historic. However, that one building is going to have a higher level of scrutiny. You may not be able to do certain things to it because of those character-defining features, whereas those other 2 buildings on the property, you could do more to it. However, the modifications would need to be sympathetic to the initial historic structure and to those character-defining features on the structure. And so I know that this may be becoming fairly complex, but I'm going to pause for a moment and now walk us through if we're a tenant in one of these buildings. So you've rented the building, it's been more than 4 years, you want your unit painted. You come in to our office. We inform you that you do need to make the request to your landlord and wait 30 days. So you never in any case get to file and then wait 30 days for your hearing. You always have to notify the landlord. So they've notified the landlord and they're waiting 30 days. That also is going to, if there's anything identified in the common areas, we're also going to notify planning, and we're going to work with planning, see if planning's able to do their review within that 30-day period. I can't make any promises for staff time and capacity in planning in order to accomplish that within the 30 days, but that's going to already trigger that review. Now, 30 days have lapsed, their unit hasn't been painted, it's not within the Mills Act. That case can proceed forward for the rent reduction of the unit. Anything that's within the common areas, however, is going to have to wait for the determination under the Mills Act that there's been a violation, and then that can proceed forward as well. So I hope that's helped clarify and not muddled it more.
So what you said is basically this modification is not going to really impact the inside of the tenant's unit.
I honestly don't think that this is going to impact the tenant's ability to file for a rent reduction that much,
That's the way that
not within the unit at all.
Okay, so because the way it's written, or the way that I understood from this, that it's going to impact, so maybe that would be something that to clarify it?
Well, it may not be possible because in those cases where there might be a case out there where a Mills Act does apply to the inside of the unit, I'm not sure that that it's safe for us to rule that out completely.
So then, the example you provided could be the exception from the, the exception, not the, again, depending on how many units we have and how many exceptions could be, but the general understanding is that this modification would apply to the unit.
Well, let's look at the actual language.
Not,
let's look at the, and I apologize, let's look at the actual amendment language itself, because the second line, it does say that interior common areas are not required to be painted once every 4 years, and building exteriors every 7. And so it's actually not exempting the interior of the units at all from our existing maintenance standards. It's just the interior common areas.
But this is mentioning the current maintenance requirement. This is the current maintenance requirement, right? You talked about.
The underlined and italic language is the recommended language that we would be adding to the code.
Italics underlined, third paragraph.
Okay.
Page 10, center of the page, the underlined italic language, that's the proposed language that would be added to the code.
It says not required to be painted once every 4 years.
While you're reviewing that now, Commissioner O'Keefe, you had another comment?
Yeah, so I have a question and possibly a comment. The question is, under the current Mills Act and city practice, can a landlord only paint an exterior and interior common area if they have approval / an order from the planning services? Or can they do it on their own?
So if a property is currently under a Mills Act contract for repainting, they would be required to obtain a certificate of appropriateness. And for minor scopes of work like repainting a building, that is done administratively.
I don't know all the terminology. I'm still not entirely clear. Does that mean, I guess, just if you could answer yes or no?
Yeah, so they would be required to get permission from the city, but it could be handled over the counter, so to speak.
Okay, so I think that some kind of amendment's necessary. We can't have a catch-22 where one hand of the city is saying you cannot repaint it without permission and you can't under some circumstances, and the other says you have to. So clearly some kind of amendment's necessary. When Mr. Noonan was walking us through the timeline, I believe you were saying that maybe the Planning Commission could review it in that 30 days between when the tenant notifies the landlord and when they would file for an appeal. However, normally the city isn't involved at that point because the landlord has the initial 30 days, so the tenant wouldn't be used to having that be part of the procedure of the city gets involved in this stage and we determine. So maybe different, this doesn't necessarily have to be an ordinance, but it could be in regulations perhaps where we have actually lay out the procedure. So for example, you could say the tenant says this isn't in good repair, the common area or the exterior common area isn't in good repair, and then the landlord has to quickly either say, yes, I think it is in good repair, in which case they can immediately, go to the planning department to determine, or they can say, I agree, and they'll go to the planning department and ask about painting it. But I wouldn't want it to be that the tenant says, hey, landlord, this isn't in good repair, according to the Mills Act, and then they have the 30 days, and then they go to the city and have another delay.
Yeah, I'm pondering that. The challenge that we'll have is that we, the city, are going to have to know. And it sounds like the planning staff are working out a more frequent review process so that it's going to be these buildings are going to be reviewed more frequently than the advisement under the Secretary of the Interior's language of the 5 years. It sounds like it's going to be much more frequent than that. But still the challenge that we're going to have is that we're going to have to know one way or the other that there's an issue. Unless the tenant comes forward, that's going to be the struggle. So I think perhaps as Commissioner Marks alluded to, good communication to the tenants is going to be essential here because certainly we need the tenant to be acting on this so that the city can remain impartial. But we still need to provide enough information to the tenant so that they know the process. Whether we enact it in the regulations or if we establish good language and communication that we send out, we can, if we're able to flag the units in our registry, and we'll see if we can do that, we can certainly include information in the tenant packets. We can add something to the educational seminars that we do twice a year, and then we can provide some basic information on the website and in our lobby. I'm wondering if that won't address the issue, to providing that guidance for the tenants.
Yeah, I think it's not just guidance, but also just figuring out the procedure for the staff, because proactive, the planning commission on its own, inspecting places every 5 years is great, and that's something, but of course, the paint could be fine 5 years in, but before it's been 10 years, on year 9, it might be in pretty bad condition.
If I can just add a couple of points. One, I think that, just to reiterate, that the more information provided to our tenants about this proposal, the better. I would suggest that staff does flag all of the buildings that are currently in Mills Act, covered by Mills Act, so that each time there is a re-registration for a new tenancy, when that confirmation of the re-registration goes to that new tenant, they also get some kind of at least just bullet points going, you are living in a Mills Act building, these are the maintenance standards. If you have further questions to the residents of those affected buildings, or that the standards for their building are separate. I think you said there's 39 buildings, 600 units. If we could try our best to flag those in our system so each unit automatically gets notified when it's re-registered. I would even suggest that if this becomes part of our ordinance, that we send out something to each of those units at this time to notify them of this change. And the question on the Mills Act, it's a carrot and stick. The carrot is a substantial reduction in property taxes. The stick is they have to agree to the terms of the contract. So I understand that if a tenant were to say that, my building hasn't been painted, needs to be painted, if city staff agrees going, it's been long enough and the painting needs to get done under this. If it doesn't get done, the tenant can move for a reduction in rent. However, if the landlord does not do so, is there a risk the landlord could lose their Mills Act contract for not adhering? What's the process for that? Is it something done in the city, or is it a county process?
It's a process that's initiated by the city. So if the city is made known that a property is in violation of the Mills Act contract, the city will typically send a letter basically notifying them that, hey, you are in violation of your contract and you need to correct it. And if you don't, then you are subject to termination of your contract. And if and when that happens, fortunately it's never happened in West Hollywood before. But if it does happen, then there are substantial financial penalties for the property owner, which includes basically the city recovering the lost tax revenue for a certain period of years, preceding that. So it's a significant.
It's a big stick.
Yes.
If that were to occur and then a landlord were to comply with the order for the maintenance, would they be able to reapply to once again get their property covered by Mills Act, or once you lose that designation, it's forever?
So we have never come across that, and that's typically that's sort of like the last resort. I mean, the city will do almost everything it possibly can to bring the property into compliance. And so, there has not been, an example where the city has had to terminate a contract and then potentially have that, that same building reapply for another Mills Act. But I would say that, hypothetically, that could occur. That could occur.
And I know that you moved here from San Francisco, which is another rent-stabilized jurisdiction, and they have a preponderance of I think they're called like the painted ladies. They're really beautiful old Victorian Edwardian structures. Do you happen to know what San Francisco's policy is on the exterior maintenance of those historic structures?
The standards in San Francisco are very similar to what they are here in West Hollywood. I mean, most cities in California adhere to the State Office of Historic Preservation's standards, which, align with the Department of Interior's Secretary standards. So they're aligned in most cities.
And then you can punt on this last question if you want. It's something I emailed you about, where we had an appeal earlier in the year about a Mills Act building where there was an issue with elevator maintenance, and staff wasn't able to answer the question if the maintenance of an elevator is covered by the contract, if the mechanics are covered by Mills Act, or would it just be, if there's a walnut inlay that's part of the aesthetics of that elevator, if that's the portion that we've covered. And if you want to punt on this for tonight, I totally appreciate that.
Thank you for your email, Chair. I haven't had the opportunity to research that property yet, so what staff can do is look at the Mills Act contract for that property and the associated work plan, and I'd be more than happy to report back to you as to what scopes of work are within their plan. But, you know, something like building systems like elevators, you know, HVAC systems and things like that, typically are the items that would be included in a work plan. So I will look into it and report back to
So
you.
the mechanics of a building could be, in theory, part of a Mills Act contract?
Oh, absolutely,
Okay.
yes.
Thank you. Commissioner Kirby?
The question, so I just wanted to clarify, make sure I understood, and I've been reading this over and over. So interior, this does not change the interior paint, correct? Except for interior common areas. That would apply exterior and interior common areas, but not the interior unit.
That is correct.
Okay, so that would still be the same old process we currently have. So the city's never terminated a Mills Act contract? That doesn't really make me feel more confident that the city is watching these closely. And that's just anecdotal. I mean, I have no property in mind, but.
No, the city has not yet. And so when the city enters into a contract, it's a 10-year contract, and it's a rolling contract. So basically, you know, it renews, you know, every year, so that it's always, you know, 10 years. So let's say, for instance, if the city decides in 2020 that it wants to terminate a contract, that termination wouldn't take effect until 2030.
Even if there were violations of?
Yes, yes.
So we could be stuck in a situation where, even though we're only now talking really external and common area, which I'm a little less concerned about, when applying our rent stabilization ordinance protections, we have a bad building in year 2, 8 years, tenants are without that protection. Is that what you're telling me?
There's other,
I know that's extreme
there's other
case.
penalties for violating, and Doug, correct me if I'm wrong on any of this, I believe because this is within the zoning code, that there are some other, there's financial and potentially jail time penalties for violating codes, including some of these codes. Is that correct?
That's correct. Actually, I'm thinking right now of a particular owner of an apartment building that is a landmark, and I previously worked on a code enforcement case with our code enforcement staff, and that particular property owner individual did go to jail, basically. So,
in terms of, like I said, I'm much less concerned now that it's only dealing with external and common area paint. In some of the cases that we've seen and the commission has held is that there's a tenant in a unit, they're using a balcony, let's say, they use the balcony for X amount of years, and then all of a sudden the city finds out that that balcony exists, and they close off the balcony. It's a code violation. The commission has always held, or I won't say always, from what I can remember, the commission tends to hold that it's, even though the city required them to do this, required them to take away the service, the tenant may still be eligible for a decrease in services, and the commission has granted that in those cases. Is there a way that we have a very strict standard with the paint here? I mean, it's very specific in our ordinance. You shall do this once every 4 years, or once every 7 years, or not less than once every 7 years. Is there a way that maybe similar to carpets, where carpets still we hold to a very high standard, but we have that section in there that says unless they're like new or something like that. I don't know the exact wording. I don't know of a case where we have considered it like new after all those years, but we still have that in the ordinance, unlike the paint, I guess. If we were to have something like that in our ordinance, our existing ordinance, where it said had to be painted every 4 years or be like new, that would allow for us, I believe, to have the Mills Act contracts not necessarily automatically grant reductions to the tenant unless it were a not like new, or we could use whatever standard. that would add some protections to the tenant while still allowing, while weakening the existing where we have you must do and it violates the contract. Do you see where I'm going?
Perhaps if the commission would like to propose language, we could provide that as part of your recommendation to the council.
So I wouldn't want to say that the paint would be like new. I'd be more comfortable if there were language saying if the paint was being maintained pursuant to the terms of the Mills Act contract, because, we don't want a beautiful historic structure to say the paint is peeling, put a coat of white paint that looks new on this building. That paint would have to meet with the, Doug, I'm not sure you said there was
Isn't it currently saying that?
what was the term you used for the approval of the painting? You said it was kind of over the counter, but there was some.
Certificate of appropriateness?
Yes, so that whatever that painting would have to comply with that.
That would be the law. If it were this way, I believe. That's what we're saying. We're moving it from a hard 4 years to whatever the certificate, whatever the Mills Act required. We would be taking that away from the tenant.
Say that one more time, please.
We'd be taking that away from the tenant. That's what we'd be changing. We'd be putting it in the Mills Act. So that's what essentially what you're saying. It is. They would have to maintain it to the Mills Act contract.
Correct.
But if that's still, my concern is it's taking it out of the regular process and essentially removing this from the tenant's ability at all to complain unless it were in violation of the Mills Act contract, which is not something the tenant gets to participate in.
I don't think it's removing the tenant's ability to request a service or a complaint, however you want to word it, just saying that the standards are different for a Mills Act building, and that it just because the building has not been painted in 7 years, because it's Mills Act, there is another step in this process. I don't see it as a removal of the resident's right to request that service and for the city to determine whether it's appropriate or not. It's just because it is a historic structure, which is why I think that all tenants should know that they're living in a Mills Act building, saying that you can request this. There will be someone from the planning department that will review that request, and then there will be a determination at that point. So I don't see it as a removal of, it's adding a step to the process.
You're right. I mean, I agree with you. I guess my distrust is in the city, and no offense to our city, but my distrust is in the city. The current system that we have that adjudicates tenant issues as a third-party, unbiased hearing examiner, now we're putting it into a planning and development services director or staff who I just don't see it as being the same. That's the only thing.
Could I ask the staff that might be charged with making these types of determinations, would they have a background in historic structures, or would it just be someone in the planning department?
So, for example, I would be one of those staff. I do have a background in historic preservation, but the city also, our department also has a contract historic preservation consultant, Chattel Inc. They've been our consultant for several years, and actually they work with us to a high level of detail on all of our historic preservation related issues, including Mills Act contracts and cultural resource designation nominations and things like that. So we have professional expertise, individuals who are on call. Actually, they come in every Thursday and are available to staff whenever it's necessary. And also one thing I would like to note is that so not all of the buildings that would be affected by this ordinance or this amendment are under Mills Act contracts. So of the 39 buildings that this ordinance would be subject to, only half of them are under Mills Act contracts. And so that's why the amendment was written specifically to state that the building shall be maintained in good repair and in compliance with the provisions of section 19 whatever of the Cultural Heritage Preservation Ordinance. And the reason for that is because that would capture all historic buildings, regardless of whether or not it is under a Mills Act contract or not.
So now I'm a little confused. So if these are not all Mills Act buildings, who makes that determination of the buildings that are not under Mills Act that it is a culturally sensitive building that would have that additional requirement?
So the city already has an inventory of those buildings. I have the list right in front of me right now. So of those 39 buildings, 18 of them have applied for and are under contract with the city for Mills Act. The other 18 buildings have not applied for whatever reason they have elected not to. And it's because, this is an elective program. It's not,
So are the owners of those buildings that are not under Mills Act, are they aware that their buildings might have a different standard, or would they be made aware of that?
These buildings are all under the same standard. They all have to comply with the Historic Preservation Ordinance because they are designated landmarks. So whether or not they have a Mills Act contract, they are subject to the same standards.
So I understand that, but for the buildings that are not Mills Act, do those building owners realize that their building has that historic designation? Is an owner of a building aware that the city's done a survey and that their property has been identified, so it wouldn't be a total shock to them? They find out the standards might be different?
They should be aware, yes, yes.
So do we, so I guess I need to ask that,
So, just to clarify, please, could clarify, these are designated buildings.
Yeah.
The owner is very aware.
the
that
owners
their building
are
is
aware that they've been designated? Okay.
Learning that, and I apologize, learning this little nuance, I wasn't aware of this before tonight. I would offer a friendly amendment to this language, and it's under, notwithstanding this exemption for designated cultural resources, a rent adjustment may be granted when the landlord has failed to comply with section 19.58.160 or a Mills Act contract requirement. Because right now, that language it essentially applies the alternative maintenance standards from 19.58.160, but it specifies that the rent adjustment is only applied when there's a Mills Act contract on the site. Let's just broaden that out and be very clear that it's when that violates 19.58.160.
I would be in favor of that friendly amendment. Thank you for clarifying.
I just wanted to ask Doug, is that list you have in front of you, could you make it available to us? I've lived here all my life, so I bet you I know everyone, but I would like to have the list if that's possible.
Absolutely, yeah. This list is in a report that was produced by Page and Turnbull, who was our historic preservation consultant that the city contracted with when we started the study in 2013. So this report was published in 2016.
So could we get a copy and
Absolutely.
then maybe give it to the secretary for next meeting to present to us?
Sure.
Thank you very much.
So now, with that correction, I'm to read this as this would apply to all designated buildings. Is that correct? All historically designated buildings, or whatever the technical term is, cultural heritage preservation, or we're talking about all 39 buildings, right? Any of them that are designated, regardless of whether they have a Mills Act, this change in the rent stabilization ordinance would fall into play. So now, whereas before in all of our conversations, I was thinking in my head, there's a Mills Act, there's a contract, there's specific guidelines. What is there for historically designated? Is that where the characteristics that were talked about earlier come into play? What is it that we're looking at objectively now to determine whether the common area paint is meeting, what's the standard we're using now? Before I was envisioning there's a Mills Act, there's something that specifically says. So what is now the Development Services Director deciding or judging when someone complains about their common area paint?
So what the director would be judging is whether or not that is just having an overall impact on the quality of the building, if it's falling into disrepair. I mean, there won't be any character-defining features within the interior of the building. I mean, there will be, for a lot of buildings, there are character-defining features on the exterior, of course, but none are located within the interior of the building. So if I understand your question correctly, the purpose of this amendment is just to ensure that the building is maintained to a certain standard. And if it's not, then, then the city will take action to ensure that, the property owner, the landlord, does what's necessary to, bring it into good repair and keep it properly maintained.
So my issue with that is, so we currently, the very strict law that we have right now, the strict standards we have right now, I don't believe that just because paint is 4 years old that it's deteriorating the building. But I uphold decisions like that all the time as in a lack of service. Now it's, and granted, this person would be an expert in the field and know these things based upon the overall building, but it would have to be pretty bad to be considered paint in a common area to have a detrimental impact to the historic preservation of the building, wouldn't it?
I think that depends, it's on a case-by-case basis. I mean, generally speaking, a preservation best practice is that, when there is too much accumulation of paint, that's going to cause damage to the underlying structure, which is the whole, intent of this. And so, I guess I'm not sure I understand exactly
I'm a
what.
tenant, I move into a building, and 10 years later, it's never been painted, and I'm feeling like this is not what I want to live in. This is not the walkway I want to walk through every time I come home, and I'm still paying more and more and more rent every year. Just because they haven't painted it for 10 years is not going to have a detrimental impact to the historic preservation of the building in most cases. So we have a tenant in a situation where their standard of living is slowly decreasing compared to all their peer tenants in other buildings, and under this standard, that it's only if it negatively impacts the building or it has a detrimental impact on the building. That seems like it could happen all the time, I don't know, but it doesn't seem like it's a very clear standard or pro-tenant standard.
Let me, if you would, let me confer with Doug for just a moment, because I think that we can answer this in a reverse, if you will. So, okay, so what I asked was, if we look at it in the reverse, would it be more appropriate to take a case where the property owner came in every 4 years and requested a certificate of appropriateness to paint? And would the department say, go ahead, unless there was the situation where the paint was going to actually harm the building? Versus what I may have been hearing this wrong, but I was kind of hearing that the city wouldn't allow the painting to happen unless it was absolutely necessary to paint the walls, which is, if you think about it, it's kind of a reverse, where that landlord's coming in saying, may I paint? And the city's saying, no, you may not paint because we've determined that you don't need to because the building's not at a state of dilapidation that requires the painting. I think it's the opposite, where the city, the question would be, every 4 years, the property owner is coming in, I'd like a certificate of appropriateness, I need to repaint the walls, and planning is going to look at that and take it from there, Doug.
Yes, I mean, planning will take a look at that. I mean, if an owner wants to, repaint their building, obviously, they certainly would be allowed to. the only instance in which the department would object to that is if the excessive painting of a building, has led to the beginning stages or will lead to damage to the underlying structure of the building. So I think that, if a landlord wants to be, a good landlord and paint the building consistent with, this particular schedule, then they're more than welcome to. But I think that when the city is concerned is when excessive painting could lead to, the damage of the building.
Peter, are you saying it's like if the tenant said, my breezeway needs to be painted, it's horrible, they come into the city, or the landlord says, I don't think so, but I'm going to go to the city and I'll ask to paint. And then the city says, does their evaluation says, no, that would be detrimental. In that case, are you saying that in that case, yes, that they would determine it was detrimental, but some cases they might say, no, it's not detrimental, go ahead, and the landlord could go ahead and paint? You saying that? So I guess my thing then would be, so maybe we make that a requirement in that process that if after a certain amount of years, give at least minimum 4 years, or if it deteriorates to such a level that the tenant wants to make that complaint, if the city says no to the landlord, like the landlord would have to then go to the city and ask. Like I'm saying, they would need to then take that tenant's complaint and then go to the city and say, I should paint. And if the city said no, that'd be fine. We could relieve the tenant or the landlord from having to reduce the rent at all, or even go through that hearing process. But if the city says, you can if you want, or if the landlord refuses to go to the city to even ask, could the tenant then still go through the process that we have in place now? Or a
Yes,
similar process anyway?
yes, and I'd like to have a look at line 4 in the new code. So there's 2 criteria, and it's required to paint every 7 years, but shall be maintained in good repair and in compliance with the provisions of section 19.58.160. And so our hearings examiner could still consider a rent reduction if the building is not being maintained in good repair. And I think that might address your concerns where they're complying with the historic preservation requirements. However, the paint's filthy. So that's not good repair. That would still be subject to a rent reduction.
And that's what I'm saying. But to get the benefit still to the landlord, would we still want to put something in there? Because otherwise, we're almost under the status quo where the landlord would still have to deal with this all the time.
If you'd like to, maybe the commission would like to propose language.
I'm kind of throwing it out there. Like, is this would something like that be taking away the benefit of what we're trying to do, or no?
I think the hearing examiner's discretion with good repair is fine for me. I'm just saying.
Commissioner O'Keefe?
Yeah, I think the hearing examiner, if the language, notwithstanding this exemption for the designated historical cultural resources, it can be granted if, and then we add the good repair language in. And of course, we cannot be putting these building landlords in a catch-22 where they're not allowed to make a repair by one body, but another body's ordering it. So it could say, in consultation with the Planning and Development Services Director or with their approval or something like that. But I think the concern was, and I might be misstating it, but if a tenant finds that their place isn't in good repair, the landlord on their own might not choose to paint it that often, and we wouldn't want them in a situation where they don't have a remedy. But I had a different question as well. As we've talked about this more, it sounds like the vast majority of the cases, what causes a building to be designated a cultural resource doesn't involve the interior common painting, yet across the board we're exempting all of those properties from the 4-year requirement. And I'm wondering if that should be included across the board, and if so, why? And if there might just be a handful where the interior is counted, why not just say if the interior is part of why that specific building is considered it, then it's waived, so we're not exempting unnecessarily too many buildings.
I think that's a great suggestion. Like you said, I mean, in most cases, or I think probably in 99% of the cases, the interior of the building is not really subject to a lot of scrutiny when we look at certificates of appropriateness or alterations to, designated structures. What the city is more concerned with is the appearance of the building from the outside, from any public right-of-way. I mean, that's sort of what the Secretary of Interior standard states is whether or not the building is able to, convey significance from a public right-of-way. And that can lead to areas, common areas as well. So I think that, in this particular case, maybe perhaps it might be good for us to sort of make that clarification, because I just wanted to stress the importance that, this amendment only applies to, the common areas of the building and not, an individual tenant's, unit.
Understood, but even so, if that's not part of what made them be designated, and if it's not something they're not allowed to change, then why, maybe the Bradbury building, there might be a couple where the interior is a big part of it, but if that's not part of the order, why not have the regular standards apply? So maybe my thought is, since there seem to be a few things we're talking about making little tweaks to, maybe we could be presented with revised language at the next meeting and then take a fresh look at it with fresh eyes.
Do we want to file and receive this or make a motion on it? Or it's coming back, right?
Yeah, I think that's it sounds like that's what's the decision before the commission would be direction to staff to make some changes to this language and to bring it back.
Right.
We're all okay with that? Yes? All right. Thank you very much. Back to item 11, unfinished business. Continue the discussion on our duties listed in Municipal Code Section 2.64.090, specifically for evaluating and recommending to City Council relative to the city's housing policies. Commissioner O'Keefe, would you like to start the discussion?
Sure. So I think where we left it at the last meeting where we discussed this was that the majority, but not necessarily everybody, thought that within the purview of housing policies could include anything related to tenancies. So anything related to rental units, units that were for rent, not necessarily an exclusive language, but saying housing policies includes anything related to rental units, including the rent stabilization ordinance, the rent stabilization regulations, and anything else about the maintenance of rental properties. So that's something I was quite comfortable with, and I'm tired and have nothing else to say.
just to refresh my memory, were you discussing that our discussion would include non-rent stabilized properties?
Any tenancy, the non-smoking ordinance that they've been just thinking of the work of the commission in the last year and the things that we thought should be included. I thought that was a thread that went throughout all of them. So non-smoking in all rental units, I think, was something that we talked about. Proactive load compliance, I think, also related to all rental units. Certainly the 12-month tenancy that the majority of the commission wanted to take up was about all rental units. So I think that that's kind of a thread that's defined the things that we've opined on over the time I've been on the commission.
I may just to add to that as well, of course, the commission knows that the tenancy protections in the RSO, in fact, apply to all tenants in the city, that it's just that the rent limitations are subject to units that were built before July 1st of 1979, but all other aspects of tenant protections apply to all tenancies.
I think Commissioner O'Keefe summed it up nicely. I think it threads the needle between not going too expansive of our role and then also not pigeonholing us, like the clerk was saying, the broad enough language that we're able to do what we want to do without having to amend the ordinance as necessary. So I think the language you propose would be fine for us to send to council if they want to approve that language or give us direction otherwise. But I think that was pretty spot on.
Richard? Commissioner Kerpes?
I'm in general in favor of keeping it as broad as possible. Just my opinion is not amending it at all. And being directed by council or making recommendations as we see fit and seeing, if that mayor and mayor pro tem lets it through or not. That's just how I feel about it.
Just a quick comment. Since historically the only rent-stabilized units have been were within the purview of our commission, so now we're expanding, and obviously there's a reason for it, and I understand that. So now it's kind of a broader definition of housing. So then why don't we change, as I said, as I suggested at the last meeting, Rent Stabilization Commission and Housing? Maybe we can change the title so that would kind of justify why we are now looking into the other areas that the Rent Stabilization Commission historically never looked into before. So I believe that would probably reflect the new changes that are happening in the city and in the county and the state. But I'm satisfied with what you suggested.
I'm very hesitant about any changes beyond, we are the Rent Stabilization Commission. Our ordinances pertain to the rent stabilized units within our city. Unless there would be a directive from council saying that we would like to expand your duties to include all rental properties within the city, I think it's an overstep, at least in my role as a commissioner, overstep for my work to weigh in on non-rent stabilized units. I think it's beyond our purview. Again, if council, if we want to send something to council saying that we think that we should be expanded to include non-rent stabilized units, I'm not saying I would vote in favor of that, but if the commission wanted to do that and see how the subcommittee were to treat that request, but I am really hesitant without direction from council to expand our duties beyond the rent stabilized units.
I would recommend that maybe Commissioner O'Keefe makes a motion, since that's your language, and we can vote on it, since we're getting late.
And I would say for those that don't want to limit us, the reason I wanted to bring this up is because we were told something wasn't in our purview that I thought was in our purview. And so if we say our purview includes, but is not necessarily limited to blank, and the council approves it, then presumably we won't have to one by one ask for permission to weigh in on those things.
What did we get?
12-month lease
Who
thing.
told us that?
City staff.
City staff told us that.
But that was after they'd consulted with the council. So we were told earlier today by the city clerk that if it's within our purview, then it's something we can do. So anyways, my motion would be, let me look at the specific language from the ordinance for a second. The commission's duties to evaluate and make recommendations to the city council relative to the city's housing policies includes, but is not necessarily limited to, recommendations on any rental properties, including the terms of lease and maintenance standards.
Chair, I'm going to, point of order, this is out of order because we do not get to define what the ordinance says is our duties and what our duties are not. We may all have our own opinions of what they are, but we do not get to change the ordinance of what our duties are. So I think that this motion is out of order.
So I think we were told staff, what would be, excuse me one second, what would be an appropriate format for this commission to send a thought to council?
If the commission had a recommendation on on defining this, we could forward that to the council.
If I may, the city clerk specifically asked that we do this, so clearly it was the clerk's opinion that this is something that we could do, make a recommendation about the definition.
It's the chair's decision. I'm saying it's out of order, but the chair will have to rule.
I have a motion on the floor. I don't have a second yet.
I would second Commissioner O'Keefe's motion.
So then the chair now needs to make a decision whether it is out of order or it is not out of order. And then once the chair makes that determination, if the majority of the commission disagrees or somebody wants to challenge the chair, then it would take a majority of the commission. But for right now, my point of order is that that motion was out of order, so the chair needs to make a decision of whether it was in order or out of order.
I'm going to say that it's within order. Is that the correct term? And allow the motion to go forward. So we have a motion, we have a second. And Secretary, can we have any discussion before we call a vote? We have a roll call, please.
Commissioner O'Keefe,
Aye.
Commissioner Kerpes,
No.
Commissioner Maggio,
Aye.
Commissioner Martz,
Aye.
Commissioner Charity,
No.
Vice Chair Chopchian,
No.
Chair Bergstein.
No. It was a 4-3 vote, so it did not pass.
4-3.
Thank you. Going on to item 12, I don't see any public here for public comment.
Before you move on, should we see if there's an alternate proposal, since the agenda item was to define housing policy?
If you would like.
Or not, the commission could also decide that you don't want to, and we could forward that recommendation that the language is, that it's the commission's opinion that the language is left open.
Could we forward to council that this was in the report for next council meeting, this was discussed and it was declined by the commission?
It will
No
be
action,
part
thank
of, it'll be part of the minutes that are in the action report. Just be mindful that when we do these action reports, if you change your minutes later, you're going to have you'll have the different minutes in the action report, but it will be in the action report on the next council meeting.
Unless someone has an alternate motion that they wish to make, I think the commission listened to your motion, we took a vote, and it was declined. If someone wants to make an alternate motion, we can certainly discuss that.
Okay, I don't see any. I just wanted to give space in case one of the no votes wanted to propose it means everything or something.
Moving on to item 13, commission comments.
Sorry, I was a couple minutes late. I don't know if there was a welcome. I see we have a new commission secretary, and welcome. Sorry we kept you so late today.
I just wanted to say thank you to staff tonight for that second item was a lot longer than or that first item, I guess. I've already forgotten which item it was. It was a lot longer than what I expected, and I appreciate the very thorough answers, and I feel like I understand it a lot better, and I think we're heading in the right direction. And I wanted to thank Dan, I believe, Dan, was that? Doug. Sorry, Doug, if you're watching at home. Thank him for his presentation, and my comments earlier tonight about distrust of city staff should not be taken personally towards anyone, especially the staff of West Hollywood, who I think are amazing. It was the process that I distrust sometimes, not the individual staff members.
Mr. Maggio, any comments?
I just want to thank staff and Peter for clarification and regarding the second item. And also, Michelle, welcome back. Happy to work with you.
Okay, moving on to item 14, staff comments.
Just a point, there was a question earlier tonight about how the regulations are changed, and that is in your duties itself under point 1. It lays out that 45-day process. I do realize that language does include regulations, policies, and rules, and it does say to effectuate this chapter. And so perhaps there's some clarity necessary there to, I believe, clarify that chapter is the rent stabilization chapter, which is chapter 17, not chapter 2. But that is perhaps some of the confusion here. But what we've understood that to be is that's where the action method that the commission has to change the regulations comes from.
Questions for staff? If not, then I will adjourn to the next regular meeting of the Rent Stabilization Commission, which will be held on October 10th, 2019 in the West Hollywood Park Meeting Room, Council Chambers.